The character bursts onto the scene, brand new, mysterious, awaiting his first impression. Where will he take our story? There's a faint thought that he's new only in the sense that he's new to us. Surely there's a backstory, a history, a past, but all we know is the present. His story, it seems, begins here. It is with this quality of storytelling, the drama of sudden appearance, that Avraham arrives to our narrative. If I asked you, where in the Torah the story of Avraham begins, you'd likely tell me that it begins with a call from God to leave his homeland and journey to an unknown destination. You'd quote back the opening line of next week's Parsha, Parshat Lech Lecha, the first source on the page in your hands. And we'd marvel, like the commentators who came before us, at all the mysteries embedded within this passage. Why did God choose Avraham for this mission? Was this the first time they spoke? Why did he need to leave? Why keep the destination unnamed? Why did Avraham agree to go? What exactly was he leaving behind? These are the questions that drive Midrash, that generate extraordinary bursts of creativity, producing stories that function as the prologue before the first recorded chapter of Abraham's life. We will lean on some of these stories today in our exploration of Abraham. But first, we have to take a closer look at the text of Genesis itself, because, contrary to popular belief, the Avraham story does not begin with next week's Parsha. It begins at the end of this week's Parsha, overshadowed by the dramatic tales of Noah and the Tower of Babel. Hidden in the dry details of genealogy and geography is the actual beginning of Avraham's story, a beginning that I believe fundamentally changes how we understand the journey of Avraham. And so, we turn to the verses that immediately precede Lech Lecha, that immediately precede Genesis 12:1. This is the second source on your page. When Terach had lived 70 years, he begot Avram, which to be clear is Avraham's initial name, Nahor, and Haran. Terach took his son Avram, his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Avram, and they set out together from Ur-Kasdim for the land of Canaan. But when they had come as far as Haran, they settled there. The days of Terach came to 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. Okay, are we sensing the problem? That's a no. I'll take it. Let me explain. We think of Genesis 12 as the beginning of Avraham's journey, the get up and leave your home moment. But in fact, he's already left. Before God commands him to leave, he has already left his native land. He has already left his birthplace. And by the way, contrary to the mysterious land that I will show you in Genesis 12, it seems like he knows where he's going. There is a stated destination, Canaan, i.e. the land of Israel. And to top it off, who initiates the journey? Terach. It's not a divine command. It's not Avraham charting a new course. It's his father, who interestingly only makes it part of the way. In fact, despite the intended destination, they all seem to settle in Haran. And if you don't believe me about any of this, maybe you'll believe Ramban, Nachmanides, the great 13th century Spanish commentator who writes in your next source, Scripture says, Vayikach Terach et Avram beno, and Terach took Avram his son, which teaches us that Avram followed his father, and that it was by Terach's counsel that Avram went forth from Ur-Kasdim to go to the land of Canaan. All right. We're excited, right? We're left with a couple of big questions. Number one, how do we understand what happens in Genesis 12:1 in the Lech Lecha verse in light of the fact that Avraham had already begun the journey? Number two, why do they settle in Haran and not their intended destination of Canaan? And number three, if Terach is the one who set this whole journey in motion, what prompted him to leave? I'm going to try to answer all of these questions in reverse order, which means the first thing we need to know is a little bit more about Terach. Who was Avraham's father? And what happened that prompted him to uproot his family and leave town? So here we'll lean on one of those midrashim I mentioned earlier, the rabbinic prologue that sets the scene for the great departure. We're on the next source on your page. Breshit Rabbah 38:13, Rabbi Chia, grandson of Rav Ada of Yafo, said, Terach was an idol worshiper and a seller of idols. One time he went away to some place and he installed Avraham as a salesman in his stead. A person would come seeking to buy. Avraham would say to him, "How old are you?" He would say to him, 50 or 60 years old. By the way, nice to know that people have been bad about lying about their age for quite a long time. So Avraham would say to him, "Woe to this man who is 60 years old." Avraham knew what was up. And seeks to prostrate himself to something, an idol that is 1 day old. The customer would be ashamed and leave. One time, a certain woman came, carrying a dish of fine flour in her hand. She said to him, "Here, offer it before them." Avraham arose, took a club in his hand, shattered all the idols, and placed the club in the hand of the largest idol among them. When Terach came back, he said to his son, "Who did this to them?" Avraham said to him, "I will not lie to you. A certain woman came carrying a dish of fine flour in her hand. She said to me, 'Here, offer it before them.' When I did, this one idol said, 'I shall eat first,' and another one said, 'I shall eat first.' The big idol, who was standing among them, got up and took the club and shattered them." In other words, he told his dad that the idols got into a big fight over who'd get to eat first, and the big idol, in what would make for a very short game of Clue, is still holding the weapon that is used to smash the other idols. Okay, we go back to the text. So Terach said to Avram, "What? Are you mocking me? Are they sentient at all?" Avraham replied, "Do your ears not hear what your mouth is saying?" Terach's response is fascinating, right? Because it turns out that the idol worshiper who sells idols for a living doesn't actually believe in their power. He knows Avraham's story is a lie because he knows idolatry is a farce. His son has exposed his hypocrisy. You profit off lies you don't even believe. Now, in my memory of learning this midrash, this is where it ends. Its function is to demonstrate Avraham's iconoclastic streak, his commitment to monotheism in a world of idolatry, and the ways that he broke with the world of his father. It's evidence for why God chose Avraham to become the father of a new nation. And all of those uses of this midrash remain compelling. But the midrash doesn't actually end here. The very next sentence is remarkably provocative and harrowing. We continue. Terach took him and handed him to Nimrod. Nimrod is the king of Ur-Kasdim. He is the most powerful man in their world. He is seen as a semi-deity in a world of many gods where idols are worshipped without question. So what are we to assume that Terach is doing when he turns his son over to Nimrod? His son who has just challenged the ideological status quo of Nimrod's kingdom. Terach betrays his son, clearly endangering Avraham's life by siding with the king of idols over the smasher of idols. In what I cannot help but read as a prequel to the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac one generation later, Avraham's father is also prepared to sacrifice his son, to do what he thinks the one in power would want him to do, at the expense of the life of his own child. Yet again, the stories of Genesis are echoes of the tragic missteps of prior generations. And so what happens in this version, in Terach's Akedat Avraham, binding of Avraham? With Terach observing, Avraham and Nimrod begin to speak. We continue with the next source. Nimrod said to Avraham, "Let us bow down to fire." Avraham said to him, "Let us bow down to water, which extinguishes fire." Nimrod said to him, "Okay, let's bow down to water." Avraham said, "If so, let's bow down to the clouds that bear the water." "Okay, well, if we're going to bow down to the clouds, let's bow down to the wind that scatters the clouds." "Okay, let's bow down to the wind." "Better let us bow down to a person," Avraham says, "who can withstand the wind." Nimrod replies, "You are saying mere words. I bow down only to fire. I will cast you into it, and let that God to whom you bow down come and rescue you from it." And indeed, God rescues Avraham from the fire. Terach turned his son into the authorities, and Avraham would have died if not for the miraculous intervention of the true God. And what happens next? Vayikach Terach et Avram beno. Terach took his son Avram, Lot, and Sarai, and they set out together from Ur Kasdim to the land of Canaan. Why? The generous read is that in this moment, Terach finally realizes the magnitude of his mistake. He grasps how close he was to sacrificing his own son. And in this moment of moral awakening, he resolves to do everything he can to protect his son from here on out. So they leave town, fleeing the threat of Nimrod's religious persecution, heading to a safer place. And unlike the Akedah, where Avraham descends from the mountain alone, in this moment, Terach takes his son from the sight of his near death, and they leave together. Now, the great unknown of this story is what happened on their 620-mile journey from Ur Kasdim to Haran. All we know is that they journeyed together. But what words were exchanged? What tears fell? What pierced the silence? What do you say? What can you say to someone you've so deeply betrayed? While the rabbis in their midrash leave these questions unanswered, or perhaps better, they leave them for us to answer, they nonetheless make a remarkable claim. Repair is possible. Tshuva is possible. Terach did tshuva, Rashi writes in your next source. Terach did tshuva for the harm he inflicted on his son. They found their way back to each other, journeying side by side, settling together in a new home. And yet, we know this isn't where the story ends. Avraham does not live out his remaining days by his father's side. While the transformative potential of tshuva is affirmed and deep healing and repair are possible, our tradition also acknowledges that there are real limitations to the changes we can expect from the people in our lives. There are patterns of belief, of behavior, that are so firmly entrenched that they become inextricable. Listen to how the Radak, Rav David Kimchi, explores this idea vis-a-vis Terach in your next source. Possibly Terach did keep the other Noahide laws, seeing that Avraham had become his guide in his dealings with his fellow man. Meaning, in other words, Terach's moral evolution in his transition from Ur Kasdim to Haran was significant. He made great strides in the realm of interpersonal ethics under the tutelage of his son. But, Radak continues, the worship of other gods was something Terach, as well as his contemporaries, could not rid themselves of fully, as he was too deeply steeped in such a world outlook. Terach remains an idolater. There were changes he could not make, aspects of who he was that, despite tremendous growth, he could not shift within himself. He had come a long way, but he wasn't able to go the full distance, both internally and externally. Recall that the intended destination when Terach set off on the journey was Canaan, yet he settled in Haran. And it is in this context, having settled with his father in Haran, that Avraham receives the divine command in Genesis 12:1 to get up and leave. As Rashi explains in your last source, he had already left his birthplace. He had already left his land in the final verses of this week's Parsha. That was the departure from Ur Kasdim that his father initiated. What remained was leaving his father's house. Lech lecha mi beit avicha. God calls out Lech lecha, not at the beginning of the journey, but in the middle. In the pivotal moment in which Avraham is stuck, having settled for a life that will not allow him to achieve his true calling. God is saying, you courageously repaired your relationship with your father, but now you cannot remain with him. Keep going on your journey. Break away and become the agent of change, the blessing who brings truth on your journey, the start of something new. And someday, I hope you'll look back and understand that it was with your father, the ways he grew, and the painful limits of that growth, that your journey began. Shabbat Shalom.